Thank you, Amy. In today's talk, I'm going to talk about the role of stories in human communication. And there's kind of a thesis, if you will, that undergirds my thinking about this subject. This thesis is that communication always occurs within a cultural context, and not understanding the elements of that context can make communication difficult or even impossible. But most of us live then in a shared context to one degree or extent or another. For example, if I were to say to you, in these difficult times, or as Amy said, in these uncertain and anxious times, you all know what I mean because we're living within the context of the coronavirus epidemic. So we have a contextual sharing or a knowledge that we share with one another. Even this concept of the talk. Now, when I was younger, if someone said to me, have your parents have the talk with you, I would have thought they were referring to a talk about the birds and the bees and all that entails. But for African American young people, the talk has to do with parents warning their children as to how to act if they are confronted by the police. We speak about the most important election of our times, and we know what that means. We know what that means for this upcoming time. And especially in joke telling, I find it kind of interesting that there's a contextual context that allows us to tell and to get jokes. You go up to someone and say, knock, knock, and you know the response is going to be, who's there? We've kind of been conditioned because of the context in which we hear and understand jokes. I have to tell you, I just heard a joke last week. Those of you who are in healthcare will especially understand this. One nurse says to the other nurse, knock, knock, and the nurse says, who's there? And the other nurse says, HIPAA. And the nurse says, the nurse says, knock, knock, and the other nurse says, who's there? And the nurse says, HIPAA. And the other nurse says, well, HIPAA who? And the nurse says, I can't tell you. Nurses are rolling in the aisle right now. Trust me. So understanding through communication becomes challenging when we encounter an unfamiliar or unknown cultural context. And it impacts the meaning and it impacts the story for each of us. For example, if I said to you that compassion requires that each of us become willing to live our lives just like the Buddha did that time when he was an elephant, how many of you would understand what I'm talking about? I don't see any hands. Well, what it comes from is the story of one of the stories of what are called the Jataka's tales. And the Jataka tales are stories of the previous lifetimes of the Buddha. And so a Buddhist, depending on where they grew up or where they learned, contacted with Buddhism, would understand the story or recall this story. It has to do with Buddha in one of his previous lives before becoming the Buddha, who lived as an elephant. And he lived in an oasis in the midst of a desert. There were a group of people, men, women, children, coming towards him, and he could hear their noise. And as they came to the oasis, they told him, the elephant, and he spoke to them in a human voice, they told him that they were escaping a dictatorial king, and they were running away from the persecution and the death that was being laid upon them. So the Buddha, knowing that even though the oasis he lived in had plenty of fruits and vegetables, there would never be enough food for this large group of people that had come to see him or come to that area. So he told them, he said, go to this mountain, and he gave them directions. And he said, at the base of the mountain, you'll find the carcass of an elephant so large with so much meat that will feed you for days as you go on your journey. So as they left, the Buddha, or the Buddha to be, runs up to the top of this mountain, and with joy, he throws himself off the mountain, lands and kills himself. The villagers who are escaping come up to the base of the mountain. They find this dead elephant, and one of them notices that it looks a lot like the elephant that they had encountered at the oasis, and they discover, of course, that it was the same elephant. So the story then, the Jataka tale of Buddha, is about sacrifice and the Buddha's willingness to give of himself to sacrifice. For those of us who are not Buddhist or not familiar with these stories, that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to us because it's not within the context for most of us of the way that we encounter the world. Most of us here, I'm supposing that we either are Christians, were Christians, or at least familiar with many Christian stories or themes. So in Christianity, relating or telling the story of the crucifixion of the God who came to earth as Jesus Christ and the subsequent tale of his resurrection from the dead, well, we get the idea of sacrifice, just as the Buddha is an elephant. But for us in our context, we get the idea of sacrificing for the good of people or of the whole. So our cultural context either grants us an understanding of the stories, or our cultural context limits our understanding and appreciation of a story. Sometimes a story reveals itself in the context in which the story can be placed, even revealing to us who the story is directed to and what the story wants of its audience. For example, now my background and training was in seminary, Christian seminary. So I've got a couple of scriptures from the Bible that I want to share with you. And I think it might be, I'm hoping it'd be interesting to you. It was to me, it was fascinating. And one of the things that opened my eyes up to what I perceive now to be the way to reasonably look at some kind of a text like the Bible or other scriptures in human experience. But it has to do with the story that appears twice in the New Testament of the Bible. One is in Mark chapter 2, and the other one is in Luke chapter 5. Now, the story, it's a short piece, but it's about Jesus, and it says in Mark chapter 2, it says, when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. Now, I found it interesting right away that this concept that Jesus might have had a home. We tend to think of him as wandering all over, but here the scripture says he had a home. And it says, so many gathered around that there were no longer room for them, not even in front of the door, as he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, son, your sins are forgiven. Now, what's interesting about this story are the actual meanings of a couple of words here. First of all, the word for roof refers to the typical Palestinian designed house. Roofs consisted of cross beams covered with thatch and hardened mud. And this would indicate then that the inhabitants were poor and was typical of homes in that area. So the men who brought this paralytic tried to get the paralytic down to Jesus through the roof, had to dig through the mud, the hardened mud of that typical Palestinian home. The other interesting word I found was the word for mat. And in mat, the Greek word is used, krabaton. And krabaton means a mat that a poor person might use and which would serve as a litter. So it's interesting that in this particular story of this bringing of the paralyzed man through the roof of a house, dropping him down in front of Jesus Christ, clearly places the audience, the listeners of this story, which of course it was told originally in an oral form, the listeners of these stories relate to the characters because they too were living in a poor area of the Roman Empire in Palestine. And so these houses reflect their own homes, and they could relate then to the story. They shared their cultural context of that story. But now that same story is told in the Gospel of Luke. And in Luke, it's very similar, but there's a few interesting changes. It says here in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 5, one day while he was teaching, Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting nearby. They had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem. Now, in the first story, it was just the local people in the town that were listening to Jesus. In this story, now, it's not just the people of Capernaum, but now into the province of Judea and even from Jerusalem, which was about 80 miles away and would have been anywhere from a 4 to 6 day walk. These people had come from that far away to hear Jesus speak. But it says, just then some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a bed. Now, this word is a little different. This is not the same Greek word that was used in the first story I told, but now the word is kline, and it means a small bed, a kind of a couch that was used to recline on at meals, on which maybe a sick man would be carried. So we're not talking about a mat that a poor person would lay on, but now we're talking about something like a bed or a couch, although small. And it goes on to say that they were trying to bring him in and lay him before Jesus, but finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles in the middle of the crowd in front of Jesus. So this is not a house that was the Palestinian typical house made of a thatched roof and mud. This is more of a Hellenistic Greco-Roman house that had a tiled roof. So the audience then that Mark is addressing and the audience that Luke is addressing with the same story is presented in a different cultural context. The Gospel of Luke then was clearly centered upon Jewish listeners, and the entire Gospel pulls Jesus back into the tradition of Moses and the prophets. It's clearly geared upon people re-entering into or re-engaging the Jewish faith. Now, Luke also is a little different because let me go back and say that Mark was written probably around the year 69, maybe 70 or 71. 70, as I think Dick brought out in your sermon, was the year that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. So it's a pivotal year in Jewish history. But just prior to that, or perhaps just after, Mark wrote his gospel, anywhere from 65 to 70 CE. But in Luke may have been written as late as 110 CE. And at that time, Christianity was trying to engage the broader world. It was trying to make an impact on the entirety of the Greco-Roman culture. So the story is presented within the context of early 2nd century people as opposed to the context of early 1st century Jews. The context then in reading the story helps us to understand who was addressed and the purpose of those particular stories. Now, I have a confession to make. And this is related, I suppose, to the stories that I just told, but related to a larger way in which I look at my own context, my own cultural context in which I was raised and in which I live in now. So I have to confess that I'm not particularly bothered by the baseball team in Cleveland being called the Indians. Never bothered me when I was a kid. It doesn't really bother me a whole lot now. I'm also not bothered because the football team in Washington, D.C. was referred to as the Redskins. It didn't bother me when I was a kid, and really doesn't bother me a whole lot right now. There's another part of that confession. The Civil War. You know, I always had kind of a romantic view of the South. The South just seemed like such a lovely place, you know, and this romance of these people with a cause. And when I was a kid, little Civil War hats for children were kind of popular. And I remember I bought a rebel hat with a Confederate flag on it. And I kind of liked the idea of this romanticism of the South and the romanticism of its armies. Now, let me address that a little bit. That has changed completely. It's changed completely. And it's changed over the years, but especially it changed when I saw an interview with Ken Burns, who has done a documentary on the Civil War. And in this interview, Ken Burns mentions the number of lives that were lost because of this rebellion. So I looked it up online, and it was interesting to me that it had been accepted for many, many years that about 620,000 men were killed, or people were killed or injured during that conflict. 620,000. And then it was interesting to find that in 2011, the historian David Hacker did a diagnosis of U.S. census records from 1850 to 1880, and he upped the estimated soldiers who died in the war to 750,000 soldiers, all because of the Southern decision to break away from the United States. So that Civil War then became no more a romantic fight of an outmanned force against a larger entity. It put it in its proper perspective for me. Now, let me go back to the Native Americans, or to the Indians, as they prefer to be called for the most part. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter whether I'm comfortable with the Cleveland Indians or the Washington Redskins. What matters is the context of those people who are referred to in those names. What matters to them in their context, in the way they experience prejudice or racism, and see that lived out in names that are attached to the baseball team and the football team or whatever else it is, even though it doesn't shake me up, my feelings don't matter. It's their feelings. And I think that's true when we think about the context, that our own context often interferes with whether or not we can truly understand or appreciate the context of another person. When I was in seminary, I took a class on social justice, and the professor was an African-American man, Rufus Burrow was his name, and he talked about the experience of a young African-American man, young boy, living in Indianapolis, in the inner city. And he said, what would you do if you heard or found out that someone in the neighborhood was threatening to kill your sister? Now, for those of us who live up in Hamilton County, or many of us who live up in Hamilton County, I live in Fishers, if something like that happened to me if I had been in high school or junior high in Fishers, I would think, well, I'm going to call the police, because the police are my friends. They're my protectors. When I was a Boy Scout, the leader of our troop was a policeman. When I was an Explorer Scout, the advisor of our post was a policeman. I've been stopped by police, only given a ticket one time, and 2 warnings, got another confession, 1 ticket, 2 warnings, but it's been over quite a while of driving. But in every encounter, the policeman was very, very kind, very nice, almost apologetic that they stopped me. But now think about the context of a young African-American boy who hears that his sister's life has been threatened. He does not view the police the same way that I do. His response, as Professor Burroughs mentioned, would probably be to find a gun, to go get a gun, which was probably readily available, and he would go out and take care of it himself. So the context of how I hear that story is changed by the way that I experience my life. the cultural context that I live within. So the way that I feel, the way that I experience my life doesn't really matter. It's how does that young African American or any other person who experiences oppression or exclusion, how do they experience their life? Whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, or the struggle for LGBTQ rights and equality, those things then, and the rightfulness, if you will, of those movements cannot be based upon my own particular experience. But I, like the Buddha and like Jesus in the stories, have to sacrifice my own self-interest in many ways to allow for others to experience their lives in a way that's nurturing, in a way that they deserve to be experienced. Now, I don't know if I'm getting across the way getting this across the way that I'd like, because I don't want to demean my own experience. I have my own experiences of exclusion, not nearly as severe, but I am half Japanese, and when I was younger, I occasionally would run into people who expressed some sort of prejudice towards me, but nothing like what African Americans and others experience in today's world. But I cannot let my way of experiencing life interfere with my ability to hear the stories of others. I have to open my heart and my mind. I have to allow for the dignity of another human being and to understand the yearnings that others have for life, for freedom, for those values and ideals that we typically hold dear as humans. As we look at the past and as we project into the future, I think we want a context where all people, can flourish, express themselves, and be who they are and who they want to be. We cannot stand in the way because we don't feel what they feel. So I applaud the Cleveland Indians and the Washington Redskins if they change their name. I'm glad for it. I never was a fan anyway of those two teams. But I'm glad for it. I'm glad that I don't have a Confederate flag. I'm glad to watch the statues come down of those who led this revolt that cost the lives of over 700,000 soldiers on both sides. Rather than romantic, it's a tragedy, a tragedy. So we can all learn, I hope. I can learn, I hope, that the stories that come from the experience and the hearts of people are worth hearing and worth listening to. Amen.